Aloha kako. My name is Noah Kekuewa Lincoln, and today I wanted to share a bit about breadfruit varieties and some of the work that's previously been done, as well as work we've been doing, looking to understand the differences of breadfruit cultivars in how they grow, perform, taste, habitat, and other aspects of their characteristics. Just briefly wanted to introduce myself. So my main hat is that I am a professor with the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the College of Tropical Agriculture. And my position there is on indigenous crops and cropping systems. And so I work a lot with our heirloom crops and kupuna crops of our Polynesian ancestors, as well as different ways of growing them in the past and today. I'm also a farmer myself, the founder and president of Malpole Ulu Cooperative Farm located in South Kona. And there we are restoring the traditional breadfruit belt that used to exist in that region, a kind of diversified agroforestry system. I'm also a production advisor for several other farms, including the Hawaii Ulu Producers Cooperative, which now represents about 100 farmers on the Big Island that collectively grow, process, market, and distribute breadfruit. And then finally, I serve on the board of a number of nonprofit organizations, many of which focus on the preservation and cultivation of our traditional crops. Um, I also sit on the Hawaii Farmers Union United for Kona chapter. To start, I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Diane Ragone. She has been an amazing researcher on breadfruit over the past several decades, and quite an inspiration for me, a mentor for me, and someone who has done a tremendous amount of work to lay a foundation for breadfruit cultivation globally, and in particular, the documentation of breadfruit varieties. And Dr. Ragone has traveled all around the Pacific, revitalizing some of the old breadfruit germplasms, documenting and collecting ethnography on breadfruit varieties. Um, she had then was instrumental in founding the Breadfruit Institute, and the uh, centerpiece of the institute is the breadfruit germplasm located out in Hana on Maui at Kahanu Gardens. And there they have, I may be quoting this wrong, but I believe it's 186 accessions representing about 150 breadfruit varieties, which is the largest germplasm collection of breadfruit varieties in the world. And so a lot of the um, work I'll be talking about today does come from work that Diane has instigated, and that we have humbly been trying to build upon and carry out. So breadfruit is quite a diverse crop. Um, Shown here is just a picture from a workshop we did on the Big Island a couple years ago, and some of the breadfruit varieties that people brought in. So in this picture, in the center left, you have bread nut and meringue, which are two other Artocarpus species. And then the three fruit on the left and the right are all various breadfruit cultivars that were grown on the Big Island and brought in by the participants that day. So, a brief history of the mo'okuauhau, or genealogy of breadfruit. Breadfruit stems from bread nut, or Artocarpus camansi, and this is native to Papua New Guinea and surrounding islands in that Borneo region. And bread nut was cultivated for many millennia in Papua New Guinea and underwent quite a bit of human selection and probably started drifting towards being true breadfruit. But it's really not until our Polynesian ancestors brought bread nut into the surrounding islands and got it away from that wild ancestor pollen that we really saw true proliferation of Artocarpus altilis, or breadfruit. And so in those islands, Samoa, Vanuatu, Tonga, you really see this explosion of diversity of breadfruit. As our ancestors sailed farther east and took breadfruit with them, there was more and more selection that went on. Vegetative propagation became a normal part of breadfruit cultivation, and through this arose genetic mutations or genetic errors that also resulted in sterile triploid varieties of breadfruit. And so we also kind of group breadfruit into these fertile seeded varieties as well as these sterile triploid varieties. Bread nut also gave rise to Artocarpus marianensis, known as dug, which is more common in the Philippines and Micronesian islands, and in areas where we get overlap of Artocarpus altilis and marianensis, we also end up with interspecific hybrid varieties, which also tend to be sterile and seedless. So this is just a visual representation of what we just walked through, where you have the wild ancestor of bread nut on the far left there, the true breadfruit or Artocarpus altilis, and some of the diversity of varieties, seeded and unseeded, are interspecific hybrids between altilis and marianensis, also tend to be called breadfruit, which again are seedless, sterile varieties. And then your wild and semi-wild dug varieties as well, with their really irregular shaped fruits. So this is from a poster put out by the Breadfruit Institute several years ago. A small portion of the total poster that illustrates a couple dozen breadfruit varieties. And again, mainly to showcase the high level of diversity of things like leaf form, fruit shape, fruit size, coloration. And to start off our discussion about varieties, we should first talk about how do you identify them. And as you see from this poster, some of the key characteristics to look at when trying to pin down what cultivar you might have. So some of the key identifying characteristics of breadfruit. Tree form is a big one, so how compact or sparse a tree is. And we will talk more about this later in the presentation, in particular how the different varieties react to pruning. Leaf shape is a significant characteristic. So how lobed the leaves are, if they're deeply lobed or virtually unlobed, the number of lobes you might find on a leaf, the leaf texture, if it's shiny or more matte, if it's pubescent or glabrous. The fruit shape is a big one. Fruit texture, how bumpy or spiny the skin might be. And then the seediness of the varieties as well, whether they're truly sterile and seedless, if they're fertile but rarely produce a seed, or if they are heavily seeded varieties. So looking at the fruit themselves, they take on a number of shapes. As you get down to these irregular shaped fruits in the lower right, that's more on the dug end of the spectrum. And in general, as you get to the really round fruit, those tend to be more of the sterile triploid varieties. But you can see a whole range in between there of various shapes of the fruit. And if you zoom in on the skin of the fruit, again, you see huge variations in the texture. Breadfruit is composed of a fused syncocarp of hundreds of flowers, and that forms that hexagonal pattern on the skin. And each of those little hexagons can be various degrees of bumpy, spiny, or as in the upper left, can be quite smooth as they mature. As we mentioned, leaf shape is another aspect of the tree that's hugely variable. In some varieties, the lobes are extremely deep and virtually touch the midrib of the leaf. And in other varieties, you can have virtually unlobed, almost oval leaves emerge from the plant, and then everything in between with different number of lobes and different depth of that lobing. So this can be a very good first indicator to help narrow down your variety. We wanted to quickly go through some of the common varieties we find in Hawaii. So the most common variety in Hawaii is often called the Hawaiian Ulu. This variety is known as Ulu Maori in other areas of the Pacific. There is some debate, but it seems that our Hawaiian ancestors only introduced a single variety of ulu to Hawaii, and this is very different than the other islands in the Pacific, where you'll often find dozens of different varieties. It's pretty clear through both ethno-historic and archaeological studies that the Hawaiian Ulu did not get established with the first Va'a, the first settlers to Hawaii, but that our ancestors voyaged away from the islands specifically to retrieve ulu and bring it back to cultivate in the islands. On the right here, we have ma'afala, which has emerged as the global commercial standard for breadfruit production. This is due largely to its success in tissue culture, which has allowed the mass propagation and distribution of this variety. So many of the tree giveaways or larger orchards established in Hawaii are based on ma'afala. Another common variety is known as Malpole or Hamoa. This is one of the varieties that have almost a solid leaf, very minimal lobing to the leaves, big round fruit, and was one of the early introductions to Hawaii. Other common varieties we'll find are Afara, which is the beloved red breadfruit. The skin gets a nice coloration to it. very distinctive fruit. Pu'o is another common variety. This variety we are finding is extremely susceptible to a number of diseases, and in fact there is a large Phytophthora outbreak in Waihole on Oahu, and all the pu'o trees in the valley died in that outbreak. But pu'o is quite identifiable. It has this nice collar on the fruit where the stem attaches. Our next three varieties include two more that were heavily cultivated through tissue culture by Global Breadfruit, international plant propagator organization. So Pua'a and Otea were both part of those efforts and are moderately common among the tree giveaways and commercial orchard establishment. We also want to highlight Lippet, which is, to my knowledge, the only really common hybrid variety in Hawaii that is a cross between Artocarpus altilis and marianensis. And you can see that more irregular shaped, really bumpy fruit that's characteristics of those hybrids. There are a couple other of the hybrids floating around out there, but Lippet is definitely the most common of them. And another couple, or last couple we'll touch on here, are Fiti, which is a beautiful fruit, identified in part by its very, very long peduncle or fruit stem that attaches it to the tree. Makes these beautiful, perfectly round, cannonball type fruits, very smooth. And Mainpadak is one last one that is somewhat common. You can find it pretty readily on the Big Island. So how do these varieties differ? That will be the topic of our next sections here. So probably most importantly, the varieties do differ in their fruit characteristics. Other than the seediness, as we've already talked about, as well as the shape and the texture of the skin of the fruit, one of the dominant differences to me is really the density. There are some noticeable flavor differences between the different varieties, but in general, I would say they are pretty similar in taste. But again, their density and fruit texture, they differ quite a bit, to the point where if you're holding a lippet in one hand and a afara in the other hand, and those two fruits are the same size, the afara is literally probably twice as heavy as the lippet, a much, much denser fruit. And that really affects, for instance, the type of products you can make out of it. The lighter, fluffier breadfruits, for instance, tend to crumble if you slice them too thin, so may not be good for breadfruit chips. Whereas those lighter varieties do make a really, really nice hummus when you blend them up. Conversely, you may want the denser varieties for certain products as well. In addition to that density and texture aspect, a lot of the early work by Breadfruit Institute and their collaborators looked at the nutritional content of the fruits. And again, here there is a huge diversity when you look at mineral content, vitamin content, protein content. The different varieties can vary sometimes by a factor of 3 or 4 in terms of these nutritional parameters. And so, yeah, quite a difference between the fruit, their performance, and their nutritional value. To add to this work, we established statewide variety trials. So at 10 sites across the state, we've established 30 tree plots that consist of 6 different breadfruit varieties. The Hawaiian Maori, Ma'afala, Otea, Pua'a, Fiti, and then breadnut as the wild ancestor of breadfruit. We deliberately chose our sites to be diverse in terms of their environmental conditions, so places that are colder or wetter, saltier, windier, to look at how these different varieties performed across different environments. And through engaging in these sites, monitoring them, and also managing them, there's a lot of kind of practical management implications that we have observed over the years. So this is one of the sites about a year ago now. This is Wailua on Kauai, when the trees were about 2.5 years old. They had already been topped once at this point. Really good growth rates at all our trials. And here is our 4-year-old daughter with a 2-year-old Ma'afala tree. This is our site in Pepe'ekeo. And the first fruits we saw emerged when the trees were about 22 months old or so. So one aspect that the trees really differ is their growth form, and this really strongly affects their response to pruning. And this is one area that we think it's really important to know your variety and how that variety is going to respond to your pruning tactics. So here we see Ma'afala on the left and Hawaiian Ulu on the right, and you can instantly see the difference in their growth forms, with Ma'afala being much more compact and dense. Really can't see through that outer canopy of the tree. The lateral branches are much more evenly spaced and much more closely spaced, leading to that denser foliage. Whereas the Hawaiian trees are much more open and sprawling and spreading. And again, with pruning, these really change how the tree responds. So for instance, if you just top a Ma'afala, it very evenly distributes its growth through its lateral branches and can really bush out, doesn't immediately take on a new leader and try to go higher, but responds well to topping and provides a balanced response in getting wider. The Hawaiian Ulu, for instance, when you top it, it will tend to really choose a single new dominant leader, either one of the lateral branches or a new shoot, to reestablish itself as the main trunk and really try to establish apical dominance and put up a main leader. Other varieties like Pua'a, for instance, where you to top a Pua'a, it tends to then produce a multiple leader form, where anywhere from 2 to 4 of its lateral branches or new shoots will all kind of become new leaders and try to push up vertically. And this we find leads to not having a uniform pruning strategy across different varieties, and that you do have to account for the different responses you get from the different varieties if you want to prune them in a way that keeps them low and bushy, and that you're able to harvest the fruit easily. We've also done a lot of propagation on these varieties using a number of techniques, including air layering, root cutting, root runners. The method we use the most is adventitious shoot cuttings, where we force segments of roots to put up a lot of small shoots, as seen on the far left there. And then we'll cut those shoots off and keep them in a mist house and root them out like normal cuttings to produce trees. Um, and in this process of making the adventitious shoots, we see a huge difference in the varieties. The Hawaiian variety, for instance, responds really well. If you get a 2-foot section of root and you scarify it with a razor blade, you'll get a couple dozens of shoots come up. However, with other varieties such as Malpole, you do that exact same thing and you'll get 2 or 3 shoots come out. And this translates across the board with the same varieties that, for instance, don't put out good shoots, also being less responsive to techniques such as air layering, being a little harder to graft onto other rootstock, and just again an area where knowing your variety and how well it's going to respond can really improve your success in propagation. And again, just the area where each variety really responds differently. And a lot of times I say, for instance, oh, breadfruit's easy to air layer, whereas Ken says he can never get a breadfruit to air layer. And that difference of opinion might actually be related to the varieties, because there are some varieties that really don't take as well. Whereas again, other varieties are very voracious in putting out new shoots and new roots, making them easier to propagate. A big reason why we like varieties of all fruit trees is their seasonality, and with a collection of different varieties, we can often spread out the time in the year that we get good harvest on. The Breadfruit Institute, again, has done a big amount of work on this, looking at varieties in their germplasm and how those varieties differ in their seasonal patterns. We're beginning to explore this again along environmental gradients to see how the different varieties respond in their seasonality to different climatic factors. But the bottom line is that there is certainly variation. Certainly it's pretty easy to get a month or two shift between varieties. Things like Otea seem to come on very early, upwards of a month or two before the bulk of breadfruit seasonality. Ma'afala's kind of follows a nice peak, and the Hawaiian Ulu tends to lag a little bit behind. So even just having a small suite of varieties, you can add anywhere from 2 to 4 months to your seasonal harvest. And you can extend that seasonality even more with a broader suite. Again, and work by the Breadfruit Institute has looked at their entire germplasm, 150 varieties, and kind of characterized 10 different general fruiting patterns. And showing some of that diversity here, and you can see that you can get good fruiting in the off season, in that March, April, May time period with your right selection of varieties. Common things like Lippet and Maopo and Minepadak all kind of have that late seasonality, which is nice. You do get some of the hybrid varieties, such as the May, where you almost have this a-seasonal effect, that they fruit fairly constantly year-round. But you do see that if you do zoom out, regardless, you're still going to have some seasonal patterns with almost all varieties fruiting heavily in October, November. Almost all varieties not fruiting much at all in May, June. And so there's a lot you can do to extend the seasonality with varietal selection, but that you will still, like most tropical crops, not be able to fill in the full year completely. One of the biggest questions we set out to answer with the variety trials was looking at the habitat differences of different varieties and how they respond to different climates, on the assumption that some varieties will excel in certain climates and other varieties will prefer a different climate. And that was probably the most common question we were getting, people calling us and being like, oh, we live up country on Maui at 2,000 feet, what variety is going to do good up here? And at that time, and still, I would say the answer is we don't really know. The variety trials are starting to show some divergence, and we are seeing some of those signals come out as yields are increasing and our data set grows. But at this point in time, it is still a little too early to kind of conclusively say how some of these varieties respond. But we can say that they do respond and that we are seeing divergence and asymmetrical response of the varieties to their habitat. But I do want to quickly highlight some work recently done by one of my PhD students, Kalissimo Sio, and using a data set of over 2,000 naturalized breadfruit trees that we've mapped across the state, shown here in green. And we used those sites to train a habitat model for breadfruit to understand its climactic range and where it can grow in Hawaii. And from there, we were able to kind of parameterize the climate limits of breadfruit as far as its absolute limits and its optimal limits. And that then fed into a habitat model that we were able to produce. And then we took that model and used about 60 farms across the state that we had yield data for, and was able to then calibrate our model to potential yields for breadfruit. And this was the ultimate result here, kind of mapping out breadfruit habitat in Hawaii. And at this point, it's kind of a generic map for all varieties. But again, as our data sets continue to improve, we hope to be able to do this kind of work for specific varieties and look at their variation across the state, and use that to help inform people's selection and production of different varieties. So with that, just want to say thank you to the different funding sources that let us do all this work, as well as the many farmers, students, and interns who have helped with some of the different projects along the way. And with that, just want to say thank you guys for listening in, and very happy to talk about breadfruit anytime, or discuss opportunities for partnership or other work. So feel free to contact me at nlincoln@hawaii.edu. And mahalo.